I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service to the UW Center for Civic Engagement and the James F. Veninga Theater for tonight's event, Public Schools and Privatization, What's at Stake, featuring Dr. Julie Mead. My name is Eric Giordano. I'm the Director of WIPS. We'd like to thank our partners, the American Association of University Women, for their tireless work in helping organize this program. We also wish to thank our sponsors for tonight's event, Wisconsin Education Association Council Retired and the Wisconsin Education Association Council. Founded in 2000, thank you. Founded in 2007, the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service is a unit of the UW Colleges and UW Extension. Our mission is to address local, state, and national issues by linking public scholarship, civic outreach, and student service to enhance community life throughout Wisconsin. Our work is based on two fundamental ideas. First, we support citizen-centered democracy. Second, we embrace the Wisconsin idea. First, we believe that the strength of American democracy in the 21st century depends on the engagement of citizens and communities in making decisions about issues that matter to them. This is public work in that we promote and build capacity for work by the public, for the public. Second, as part of the University of Wisconsin, we recognize the Wisconsin idea is more than a mere platitude. The Wisconsin idea holds that the resources of the university should be used to serve the interests and needs of the entire state. To this end, WIP's task is to provide resources, information, and ideas to empower the people and communities of Wisconsin. Tonight's forum would not be possible without the hard work of Program Manager John Visti, State Development Coordinator Mandy Wright, Communications Coordinator Deb Dorhorst, Program Associate Connie Nicolai, IT Coordinator Justin Bellick, Theater Technician Chris Berg, and Research Assistants Matt Froome and Leo Mua. We'd also like to thank Marion Segrin Hall, the President and President of the AAUW, and Bob Henning. Yes, thank you. Okay, I just spilled all your water on my shoe, Julie, in case you're wondering. I didn't drink it. And we'd also like to thank Bob Henning, President and representing WEAC Region 10. Finally, we'd like to thank Dean Keith Montgomery of UW Marathon County for the campus's ongoing support of this program and our mission. Following our speaker, we will have an audience question and answer session. We will circulate through the theater with microphones. We'd ask you to ask one question per person, please, and be sure to speak into the microphone because we're recording this event. We ask that you accord our guests and each other the courtesy and respect that we would expect from a public event dedicated to civil dialogue. At this time, please check to see that your cell phones and electronic devices are silenced. Our forum will end promptly at 8 p.m. Finally, beginning July 1st, 2016, WIPS will no longer receive public funding and will be entirely self-sustaining. If you have appreciated our programming in the past or you find tonight's program stimulating, we'd encourage you to donate to WIPS. Please visit our table at the entrance to make your tax-deductible donation. Even a little bit helps. And at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Mary Jarvis, retired educator, who really was the driving force behind getting this program organized tonight. Thank you, Mary. She'll introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Eric. The fact that you are here tonight suggests that children, education, and your community are important to you. We all know that educating kids is really, really simple. All educators have to do is take a group of live wires and help them become well-grounded, right? So simple, right? But not so much. So to help us understand, our speaker has come here tonight to speak about public education and privatization and what's at stake. She will share her research on the taxpayer-subsidized private schools, She has documented their growth and explains the current features of and participation in the Milwaukee, the Racine, and the Wisconsin Parental Choice programs. In addition, our guest explains the traditional features of public schools and explains how privatization altered those features. This presentation shares research on the comparative efficacy of different forms of schools. When our guest was presenting in Eau Claire last fall and was asked, would you be willing to come to Wausau to present your research? And she responded by saying, I would love to come to Wausau. And we greatly appreciate your enthusiasm, and it matches with the passion in the room tonight. So, to help our community have constructive conversations around this topic, our speaker has come, and this is a note from her. She's here in part because of her responsibilities under the Wisconsin IDEA to share what she has learned about our state. So, with that, it is my honor to introduce to you from the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis, School of Education, from our very own University of Wisconsin-Madison, Dr. Julie Mead.
I do have a puddle. Look at that. Thank you, Mary, for that very kind introduction. And I have to say, I am feeling very humbled by the number of people that are sitting here and very inspired that on a very cold February Thursday, this many people came out to talk about and learn about education. So kudos to all of you, and thank you very much for being here. Let's see if this will work. Oh, there we go. So as you know, the title of my talk is Public Schools and Privatization, What's at Stake? Because I think if we're going to understand the policies that are currently in place and the policies that are being proposed, we have to think about not only what we gain, but potentially what we lose. So we need to think about what's at stake. And we'll start with really thinking about privatization, because sometimes that term is thrown around and people don't really know what we mean when we talk about privatization. And as you see there, that there are a number of issues that are related to privatization, but in general it's when we're using public funds for private purposes, and when in fact it's those individuals, private individuals, who direct public funds, who decide where public funds are spent, rather than we collectively deciding how we're going to spend those funds through our elected bodies. In general, when we talk about it, we talk about forms of school choice. And vouchers, of course, are one form of privatization. Tax credits and tax credit scholarship programs are another form of privatization. And charter schools, particularly when those charter schools are authorized by entities other than school boards, when they're not linked or tethered to school districts, that's another one. And particularly when those charter schools hire for-profit management companies to operate those schools. So that's what privatization is. So let's take a few minutes, though, to think about what's public education, and in particular, what's public about public education. And I'm going to ask you to indulge me here a little minute, because I can't talk about this subject without talking about that guy. That's my daddy. Dad's been gone now for more than a decade. But Dad was on the school board for a large portion of my time in school. I'm from a very large family. I'm 7th of 8 children. I'm a Wisconsin native, but I grew up in northwestern Illinois. And Dad was on the school board, and Dad and Mom, you can imagine with 8 kids, impressed upon us the importance of education for us individually, but Mom and Dad also talked, and Dad in particular, about the importance of education for democracy. And so those were conversations that we had around the dinner table. about why education was important, and particularly why public education was important. And I can remember one time, I think I was in high school, because it was just Jeff and I around the dinner table, so it was the last two of us who were, left at home. And the school board was trying to decide about some particular policy that was pending, and I remember saying something to the effect of, well, that's not going to help Jeff or me. And my rebuke was swift and clear, because Dad said very clearly, that's not my job. The school board has to think about what's good for the community. Whether or not it's good for you is not really the issue, Julie. That was pretty powerful, and it stuck with me. And so when I think about when I have been thinking a lot about what's public about public education, I know that a lot of my ideas were informed, of course, by years of study, but also by that guy and those conversations around the dinner table. And so in my mind, we have at a minimum, and these are mine, you may come up with some different features, but we have at least 5 dimensions of publicness, 5 ways that public education is in fact public. The first, and I'll just go through them quickly and then I'll unpack them for you. So the first is public purpose. The second is public funding. Third is public access. Fourth, public accountability to communities. And fifth, public curriculum. So what do I mean by all of those? Well, first, if we start with public purpose, education is not just a private enterprise. Of course, I benefit from my own education, and I benefit from seeing my children educated, but we all benefit when the community's children are educated. It's part of the commons in that way, and it's essential to democracy. I think it's pretty telling when you think about it, that even though the federal Constitution doesn't mention education anywhere, all 50 states, every single one of them, has a provision of its Constitution dealing with education. So that every state in the Union, when they constituted themselves, determined that a major purpose of the state government was public education. That's pretty powerful when you stop to think about it. We take that for granted a lot. But that notion, that public purpose of why we're doing this, and in fact, that whether I have children or not, I benefit from public education. Long after all 8 of us were gone and places and scattered, Mom and Dad were features at everything that went on in their little public school, that little public school district. In fact, one year they were tickled to death because they were asked to be the grand marshals in the homecoming parade. This had to be at least 5 or 6 years after all of us were gone. But they were such features. They were sitting right there at every play and every concert and every basketball, football. They were everywhere. So, and that's because it is a community thing. It's what we do for and with each other. Secondly, then, because it's such an important public purpose, we invest public funds. We invest collectively. Remember our history. At one time, we didn't do this, right? You got educated if your parents could afford it, and if you couldn't, they couldn't, you didn't. But over time, and of course, as I mentioned in each one of those constitutions, we said, no, we're better when we invest public funds together to meet this public purpose. And in fact, that state constitutional guarantee in all 50 states requires the state to spend money for public education. And I'll be sharing a little bit about what specifically Wisconsin's Constitution says about education a little bit later. Then we have public access. And don't get me wrong, these were some hard-fought victories through lots of litigation. My usual job is teaching school law when I'm standing in front of a group of people. In fact, we were talking about some of these issues just last night in one of my classes. But in order to get public access, some really strong litigation had to happen. And of course, you can all think about Brown versus the Board of Education as being emblematic of that struggle. But we also have cases around English language learners, cases around kids with disabilities, cases around discrimination on the basis of sex, all to recognize that public schools, in fact, have to serve the entire public, and moreover, make sure that there's equal educational opportunity. The other thing that we have about that public access is that recognition that if we have a common experience and we're learning with people who may not think the same way we think, we learn how to talk to each other in a civil manner, and we learn how to, as my grandma would say, disagree without being disagreeable, right? So that common school experience bringing everybody together is another aspect of our publicness. Next, public accountability to communities. We elect our neighbors, and we elect them for all sorts of things that have impacts on public school policy. Of course, we elect our neighbors to serve on school boards, and that's the most democratic, right? Because they're right there. We can visit them. We can show up at the meetings anytime. We don't have to drive very far. And of course, if those neighbors aren't doing what we want, we elect new neighbors. And of course, we also elect our neighbors to go to the state legislature. We elect them to go to Congress. We elect them to serve as the state public superintendent of schools. We elect them to serve as governor and as president and so forth. So all of those are ways that we can impact educational policy by exercising our vote, which also means then that those policies are accountable to us. And that we have a way through our school boards and through that local control of education to directly influence what happens in schools in either direction. And that we can hold everybody accountable by means particularly of that vote. And then finally, public curriculum. We decide collectively what it means to be educated. And I don't know about you, but what I was required to do is not quite as rigorous as what my children are required to do, because we have continually raised the standard of what we think it means to be educated. I remember, since I've had my theme with my dad going on here, I can remember one time he was just, oh my goodness, excuse my language here for a minute, but he thought that math class was going to hell in a handbasket for my brother and I, my younger brother and I, because we were not learning to use a slide rule. We used a calculator. Can you imagine? But of course, and it's funny now, I remember playing with a slide rule, but I didn't ever learn how to use it. But now you think about everything with computer technology, we would not consider our kids properly educated if they weren't computer literate. That's a big change. I have 3 daughters. My youngest daughter is 15, and she grouses a little bit because our school board in Middleton, Wisconsin, has decided that all of the kids, in order to graduate, have to do 40 hours of community service. Neither of her sisters had to do that, but she has to do that. And that's a very simple example of what I mean by we collectively decide what it means to be educated. And we decide on what's to be taught, we decide on the standards for that teaching, and we decide on how we're going to assess those standards and figure out what's going to happen next. So that's what's public about public education. And so when we think about these various forms of privatization, we need to think about them in relationship to not only what they do to the existing public school system, but what they do to those dimensions within those new public subsidies for education. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit, but let's talk a little bit about then privatization in Wisconsin. So we have lots and lots of forms of school choice in Wisconsin. Some of them are public school choice, and some are private school choice, and you can see them laid out there. So we have intra-district choice, so when a school district can decide how they're going to assign kids to schools, right? They can just assign them based on neighborhood, or they can create some kind of intra-district choice selection process that permits their pupils to go to schools not based on residence, but based on preference. Milwaukee does a bit of this, for example. You've also got magnet schools in some communities. You have virtual schools. We've got Chapter 220, which is state integration aid. Statewide open enrollment that allows folks to transfer between districts with public funds. And then we have charter schools, which are public schools. And For the majority of the state, they are authorized by school districts. You have some charter schools here in Wausau authorized by your school district. And when a school district authorizes a charter school, it can make one of two kinds of charter schools. And the difference between instrumentality and non-instrumentality is who hires or who employs the teachers and all the other personnel. So instrumentality schools, the school district is the employer of all the personnel. Non-instrumentality, the charter school itself or whoever they've contracted with is the employer of the personnel. And then we have these special authorizers. Right now, the only special authorizers are in Milwaukee, and then one in Parkside. So we have the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, the Common Council of the City of Milwaukee, and the Milwaukee Area Technical College are special authorizers within Milwaukee, although MATC has never exercised its authority. And then we have the University of Wisconsin-Parkside, which has the authority to authorize only one charter school, which it's done. And those, by definition, have to be non-instrumentality charter schools. We call them, if you've ever read in the newspaper something about 2R charter schools, that's what a 2R charter school is because it comes from the provision of the statute 1/1840 2R. And those are funded by pulling about $8,000 off the top of the state aid before they distribute it to all other districts. So you are paying for 2R charter schools, even though you don't have any in Wausau. And then we have private school choice. And we have the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, which started in 1990. The Racine Parental Choice Program that started in 2011. The Wisconsin Parental Choice Program, the statewide program, which started in 2013. And also in 2013, a new tax credit deduction, which is sometimes referred to as a neo-voucher. And that's another form of privatization. So in kind of understanding this, I think one way to really understand what all of the implications and issues are is to look at our oldest voucher program as kind of an example. What have we learned and what have we seen happen to that program? So the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program was started, as I said, in 1990, and when it was enacted, it had these features and these limitations. So it was the first publicly funded voucher program of its kind in 1990. Although I will say that you may not know this, but one of the histories of vouchers is that the first voucher program was started in the segregated South to try to avoid desegregation. And when the Supreme Court invalidated that as a method of avoiding desegregation, then it went away for several decades until it reemerged in Milwaukee in 1990. And you can see that it had several features, that it was limited, and notice these numbers, by the way, because they're going to sound familiar in a minute, that it permitted only 1%, or about 1,000 students from Milwaukee Public Schools to participate, and they had to be private, non-sectarian schools. In other words, private, non-religious schools in the city when it started. The students, to be eligible, the family income had to be no more than 175% of the federal poverty level. The participating schools were limited to enrolling no more than 49% of their overall student population. So the idea was that even though we had these publicly funded vouchers, the school had to remain more private than public, and that the voucher amount was about $2,500 per student. Now, I changed it, and I'm feeling a little nervous because it looks a little different than on my sheet. I hope all my covers change here properly. That limitation's gone. The schools don't have to be in the city of Milwaukee. There are no limits on the number of kids that can participate. The schools are eligible if they are 300% of the federal poverty level, which, by the way, is more than the median income for a family in Wisconsin. I should mention that 300% figure only applies the first year So if the family's income goes up after the child begins, the child remains with the voucher for the rest of their school years. The participating schools no longer are limited to what proportion of their school can be funded by means of a voucher. And the vouchers are now $7,210 if the child is in elementary school, $7,856 if the student is in grades 9 through 12. I should also mention another change is that the private school used to have to accept the voucher in payment of full tuition, but now charter schools can charge tuition for a family if the child is in high school and the family is making more than 220% of the federal poverty level. Lots and lots of changes, right? So let's look at what's happening now in terms of participation. This is data from this school year from DPI. And you can see we have 113, I see I'm not pointing at the right place. 113 participating private schools, nearly 27,000 students, which means that if the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program was a school district, it would be the third largest in the state. It costs us, the state of Wisconsin, $191 million this year. And that's funded by a funding formula that is shifting over time, but right now, 32% of it comes from the reducing state aid to MPS, and the rest of it comes from general purpose revenues. And finally, the average participating private school in the MPCP enrolls 82% of their students by means of a voucher. So that means they're 82% publicly funded and 18% privately funded. Let that sink in there just for just a second. And I'll show you some figures. So I did this analysis using enrollment figures from 2012 and 13. And I know these numbers are small, but I'll try and point out some things to you. Now remember how the program started, where the schools were not supposed to have more than 49% of the schools by virtue of a voucher? That's, yeah, maybe. Hello. It is not moving. I want a little red box to pop up. There it is. So that shows you that if we look at just the, and remember it originally, so I should mention something here just to point out, I can't walk away because then you won't have it for recording purposes. The first two columns are all the schools that participate in the program. Remember, some of them don't have to be physically located within Milwaukee city limits anymore. So some could be suburban schools now that can participate. That was freed up. But if you went, then the other two columns are if we just look at those schools physically located in the city limits of Milwaukee. And you can see we have fewer than 10 that have 49% or fewer kids there by means of a voucher. Now look at the other end. We'll see if my second red box will come up for me. There it is. Look at that band. We have 18 schools, private schools, that participate in the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program that enroll 100% of their students by means of a voucher. We have another 50 schools that enroll 90 to 99.9% of their students by means of a voucher. That data prompted the ACLU and Disability Rights Wisconsin in a complaint to the United States Department of Justice to characterize these schools as private in name only. Here's another way to look at that, maybe. There. Here I took the schools and I divided them into quintiles. So 80 to 100%, 60 to 80%, and so forth. And you can see that 3/4 of the schools are 80% or greater, more than 3/4. And you can see how those bands break out. So that's how Milwaukee is operated. So let's take a look at Racine. I won't go quite so much detail here, but Racine has the same eligibility requirements as the MPCP, the same voucher amounts for the schools. It's a newer program, so not surprisingly, we don't have as many participants. We have 15 participating private schools and 1,700 students. It costs the state $12.5 million. So let's look at the voucher program in your neck of the woods, the Wisconsin Parental Choice Program. Its eligibility is slightly different, at least now. But as you can see, the legislature has only expanded over time. They've never contracted. So this is the starting point. Whether or not it stays there is up for debate right now. 185% of poverty level for the first year. The same thing happens. If the family's income increases after being enrolled, they get to stay in the program for how many ever years are left before they graduate from high school. It's limited this year to 1,000 students, and no more than 1% from any one school district may participate. It has the same voucher amounts, costs the state a little over $7 million. And we do know, and this is also true, I should mention, not just in the Wisconsin Parental Choice Program, the statewide program, but actually both of the other two. Am I thumb impaired or something? There we go. The majority are folks who are kids who never attended public school. They're folks who attended private school who now have public subsidy for their private school enrollment. So we've shifted from private funding to public funding without anybody shifting where they went to school. And that's actually true in all three. The majority of kids are in that category. That one shows you for the applicants for the MPCP, or excuse me, the Wisconsin, the statewide program. And you can see from that data, again from DPI, that about 3/4 of the kids were never in attendance at public schools. So altogether then, our three voucher programs cost the state this year almost $211 million. That happens at the same time that we've had deep budget cuts to public education. And in fact, what this graphic shows, which I'm embarrassed to say, it's too tiny for me to read right now, exactly, what does it say there? The Center for Budget, right? The Center for the Budget and Policy Project, that's the source, that we have not yet made up. We're still 15% less than where we were when you compare to 2008 levels. So we haven't dug ourselves out of the hole. Other states have, as you can see, but we have not. So how about this next biennium? Oh, I didn't even push it. It went. That was good. It read my mind. This is from the Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance, and it shows the mythical average school district, of which, we don't have any of those, but you know what I mean. So they averaged them, and that shows you what is being proposed in the biennium budget bill. And what would happen is that it would freeze current revenue limits. Now, this is an important thing that I'll explain a little more. In other words, the pot of money that schools can spend on kids cannot increase unless they get a referendum passed in their school district, or unless, the other ways are if the state legislature makes the pot bigger, they could do that by releasing those revenue limits. But with revenue limits kept the same, it's a bounded system. We can't spend any more money. But they are going to take away the special student aid, the special aid payment. And so districts next year would lose $150 per student. The next year it would be restored and we'd get $15 more. It'd go up to $165 per student. But with the blue, if you will, stays the same. There's no increase. So they're not anticipating any costs for education going up from now until the end of 2017. What are they proposing? What's being proposed in the budget right now? What did the governor propose in the budget about privatization? Well, he's proposing that we expand the statewide voucher program by removing all of the caps that currently exist, so that there would no longer be a cap on the number of students who could participate, the cap on the number of schools that could participate, or a cap on the percentage of kids that could come from a single district. All of that would be gone. And I'll explain in a minute, they would fund the state aid. They would fund it in a different way than they're currently funding. Still, we have the same voucher amount in terms of a maximum voucher amount, but the way they're going to fund it is slightly different, and I'll explain that in just a second. The other privatization proposal in the biennial budget bill is to create this charter school oversight board. And what that would do was this board, an 11-member appointed board, some appointed by the governor, some by members of the legislature or leaders in the legislature, state superintendent, and so forth. That board could designate entities, charitable entities, for-profits, or nonprofit entities, to serve as charter authorizers. A charter authorizer is somebody who can enter into a contract to create a public charter school. So if we have charter authorizers, and the proposal is that these charter authorizers could charter schools anywhere in the state. So if an organization were selected by the Charter School Oversight Board to serve as an authorizer, they could be sitting in Madison and authorizing schools in Wausau, for example, or Stevens Point, or Spooner, or anywhere in the state. Right now, charter authorization is bounded by geography. You can only charter in your district. You can't charter in somebody else's district. The other thing that would happen is that a single charter, that charter contract, would permit the holder of that contract to open more than one school. So they'd get one contract, but they could open multiple schools. And it does have a provision that would say that if the school district has less than 4,000, that the school board could prohibit, in other words, the child would have to say, please, can I go to this independent charter school? The school board could say yes or no, unless the school district has greater than 4,000 students and at least 2 schools that are in one of the lowest performance categories. And so there are about 45 school districts in the state of Wisconsin, Wausau's one, that has more than 4,000 students, and school districts that have both of those characteristics, I think we're at about 12. I might have that number a little bit wrong, but that's how many have both more than 4,000 and have 2 schools that are in a low performance category. Those charter schools, if they're created this way, they would be independent charter schools, they would still be 2R charter schools, which would mean that each child would get right now $8,050 per student. And our state financing of public schools is really complicated, let's just say it that way. It's really, really complicated, but one thing you should know is the way it happens is we talk about draws, who takes the money first. And they fund the 2R charter schools first, and then they divide up all the rest of it among our school districts, right? So that money goes off first, and so if we have more charter schools, and the other thing to think about in those charter schools is that there's no accountability to voters with those charter schools under this proposal. Because, again, as I mentioned, somebody sitting in Madison who's an authorizer could charter a school in Wausau, and it wouldn't matter whether you in Wausau wanted the school or not. You would have no say in what that authorizer was doing, and unless they decided to give it to you in their largesse. They could do that if they wanted to, but they wouldn't have to. And once it's here, you wouldn't have anything to say about it. That then means that it creates a de facto appeal. So for example, if your school board were to entertain a charter school proposal and decide for any host of reasons that you don't want to fund it, maybe because of the fiscal impact, maybe because it replicates a program you already have, you can come up with all kinds of legitimate reasons why a duly democratically elected school board might say no to a proposal. This would allow a de facto appeal because they could go to another authorizer. That other authorizer could say yes, and whether or not you wanted it wouldn't matter. It would be in your school district. Let's talk a little bit more about the expansion of vouchers. So I struggled to try and make sure I found a way to depict this, and hopefully I will. So remember I said that funding in Wisconsin is a bounded system with revenue limits. That means that you have this amount of money and you can't spend more without special permissions and lots of different things. And that's made up of two buckets, if you will. The local money, which I've represented in blue, and the red money that comes from state aid or state equalization aid. And so the way they're proposing this the way it's proposed right now to fund the vouchers is that the state aid that that child would have had he stayed in the public system, would go into this voucher funding pool. And then that eventually gets evenly divided among all the voucher students. So that means then, and you can see I've got like District A that's property rich. Because it's property rich, we understand that, they can tax themselves a little bit and get a whole lot of money. So under our equalization aid formula, they don't get much state aid because they have the ability to locally fund education at the level we say it needs to be educated. So they get a little bit of aid, and that little bit of aid would go into the fund. District in the middle, where it's more split, they have more aid. They're going to have to give more aid, which means that they're going to have to make up more aid when that child goes. And of course, our property poor districts are districts that rely heavily on state aid because they don't have sufficient property funds, even when they tax themselves a lot to fund education. Those folks are going to have to give a whole lot of money. For each child, that whole lot of money is going to go into the pot. Some observations about that system. That means then that the student from the property-rich district isn't contributing much to that voucher fund, which also means that that school district that loses that child doesn't have to make up as much for losing that child to the private voucher system. In contrast, the property poor districts are going to have to absorb more costs because it's not as though they can offset the amount of state aid they're losing by reduction in the amount of costs for providing education. And I'll give you a simple analogy. Those of you who have kids and have multiple kids, think about what happened when the oldest one went to college, right? Even if we take the college funds away, we're not even talking about how we funded college. Your grocery bill went down, but your heating bill didn't. Neither did your mortgage. Neither did what you paid for gas to ride people around. Maybe you're not driving quite as much, but you see what I'm saying? There's a lot of those costs that are going to stay the same even though you had fewer people at home. Same thing happens in a school district. Even though I've lost somebody, I can't make up all the costs as a school administrator of losing that particular child. I might have a better shot if I'm a property-rich district because I'm not contributing much to the fund, but if I'm a property-poor district, I'm going to have some trouble. That also means that the more urban the district, the more likely they're going to have to absorb costs. Why? Because that's where our private schools are, right? The private schools are concentrated, most of them, in urban districts, so the opportunity to exercise the voucher increases, but that also means that our most vulnerable districts are going to be most at risk by this proposal. The amount of the voucher might actually go down. The private schools might not get as much as they're getting now, which may be a disincentive for some private schools to participate. And then finally, because the revenue caps, the way it's proposed right now, if I'm understanding it correctly, and it is convoluted, so someone can correct me if I'm wrong here, but as I understand it, It's holding our system constant that keeps the revenue limits the same. It is saying that as we go forward, we're going to allow school districts to count those voucher kids in our child counts in terms of how many kids we're supporting, although the money is leaving us right away, so it lets us count them for equalization aid. But they're not making the pot bigger. So think about that. Remember that 3/4 of the kids who participated in vouchers had never been counted on our rolls before? That means that our divisor is getting bigger, but our dividend is staying the same, which means everybody's getting less. Right? So it is going to impact, especially in those first years. It may kind of even out a little more neutrality-wise later on, but as it's currently, we're going to take a big, heavy hit as this gets ramped up. As we think about this, as we shift from this notion of public accountability into issues of private parental choice, that also means that the accountability mantle shifts from public accountability, where we together have decided what the minimum expectations, for example, that we're going to expect of a teacher in the state of Wisconsin, what the minimum expectation we're going to have for a school that teaches, please go forward, thank you, that's going to teach math or science or pick your subject, that is all going to shift to the parent. Now the parent, once again, like they did long time ago, is going to have to vet those options to figure out whether the program has sufficient content, sufficient quality, if the personnel qualifications are good enough or not. Because when you shift to the private system, all of those things we've collectively created as our regulations that guarantee us a baseline of uniformity are not in place in the private system. The other thing that worries me is that as we talk about parents being accountable for choices, think about the dynamic. If we're unhappy with what's happening in a public system now, we can petition our school board, we can try to elect new neighbors, we can do all kinds of things to directly influence that. And if they're not doing it, we can, rattle cages and talk to our state legislature about funding more for public education and so forth. But as we shift to more and more private choice, the answer is, well, what's your problem? Right? We gave you a choice. It's not our fault you're not choosing well. Choose better. And that diminishes accountability for everybody, and that's a concern that I have. It also means, of course, that in that private system there's different accountability. So I have a lot that I wanted to go through, but I'm going to try and hurry up here a little bit. So let's talk a little about what's our Constitution require. And, there's that question. So I think one of the big questions that I've been wrestling with is, if the state constitution creates a right to an education, what's that mean as we expand vouchers? And is it really a right to an education, or is it something else? Well, here's the language. It was a long time ago, so the language is kind of funky. But the legislature has to create district schools which shall be as nearly uniform as practicable. Say that 3 times fast. And we have had challenges to our voucher programs, 2 that went up to our state Supreme Court. First in '92 with Davis versus Grover, and then in '98 with Jackson versus Benson. And in both of those cases, the Supreme Court said that the programs were consistent with that education clause that I just showed you. Because that was about something else. That was about the legislative obligation to public schools, and the voucher systems were something extra, something in addition, not to perfect their obligation under the Constitution, but just an act of discretion, like doing any other discretionary program they might decide is good for the state of Wisconsin. And here are some quotes from there that illustrate that. The last one, I think, is one to point out. The state constitutional requirement should be read as not a ceiling, but a floor upon which the legislature can build additional opportunities. But notice what it said. It's a floor. That obligation to create district schools as nearly uniform as practicable is a floor. That's, if you will, a first obligation. We know what that obligation is because in our latest Supreme Court decision on the school finance system in 2000, the Supreme Court told us what it is. It upheld our system, but it also made some really important statements about the nature of that right, noting that it's a fundamental right. And that's kind of, you might say, well, okay, but that's really important language in legal talk, because a fundamental right raises the level of scrutiny that the court is going to look at. They're going to hold the state to a stronger standard when they have to address a fundamental right. They determined that at least in 2000, the finance system did not violate that fundamental right. But they said in order for it, and it was a divided opinion, but all 7 justices agreed on these 2 paragraphs. And it set up 3 portions of what it means. So first of all, it told us that we have a fundamental right to an equal opportunity for a sound basic education, and that the legislature has articulated a standard that has 3 features. First, an opportunity for students to be proficient in one group of subjects, right? Math, science, reading, writing, geography, history. And to receive instruction in a second set of subjects, arts and music, vocational training, social sciences, health, physical education, foreign language. Moreover, that acknowledges that schools and districts aren't fungible and that concentrations of kids who are economically disadvantaged with limited English skills and disabilities means that the system has to account for that because they cost more to teach, and therefore the funding system has to address those special needs. And I think a clear question is, are we doing that? And does the proposed budget meet that standard? So who's pushing privatization? Please go on. There. Oh, wait a minute. I jumped pages. How did I do that? Let me back up. Thank you. So here, this is just some questions that I've been thinking about. When and at what point does this mean that we are actually hurting the public school system in a way that's unconstitutional? And do concentrations, and we know this is happening in Milwaukee. So again, going back to Milwaukee as our oldest system, what happened there? In a system that's over 20 years old, the private schools, which don't have to serve kids with disabilities, surprise, surprise, have 2% or less. Whereas Milwaukee Public Schools now has 20% of their kids with disabilities because they have to serve them. And so that's where they are. And that doesn't even count kids who are learning English and the other kinds of ones. And so that makes me worry. Are we saying, by shifting to ever privatizing, that the right of education really isn't a right to an education, but merely the right to shop for one? I hope not. So who's funding privatization? Well, they're well organized, well funded, they're vocal and persistent, both within our state and across the country. There are some really powerful groups pushing this. So let's think about, well, what are they pushing it? These are common things that people who champion school choice say are just justifications. So are people, in fact, dissatisfied with public schools? Research tells us no. In survey after survey after survey, people are satisfied with their public schools. Are, in fact, public schools failing? I'm going to show you more about that, but the answer is no. Empirically, they're not. Dale Schultz likes to say, where are all these failing schools? You know, I even ask my Republican colleagues, and they can't show them to me. So where are they? And in fact, we know that they are not. Now, does that mean that we can't do better? Of course not. This is one of those things, this is an enterprise in which we never are there, right? We have a goal, but we're never there. We're always striving to do better, and we can and should do better in lots of ways. Well, then would a voucher, creating vouchers, you know, Milton Friedman said that open the system up to competition will create better results. We've had that system in place for more than 20 years. What does our research tell us? Is that in fact true? No, it isn't. Research does not show that voucher school programs produce superior results. In fact, In many cases, it's been worse. How about on charter schools, particularly those charter schools that are operated by for-profit management companies? Are they doing better? Nope. Research again tells us not. So if all of those things do not exist, and we have solid peer-reviewed research from multiple scholars telling us the same thing, what's our justification? Well, the justifications are often ideological. That's what's left. We want to limit government, and because public education is operated by the government, if we limit public education, we limit the government. And choice for choice sake. Choices are good, yay choice, right? That's what it comes down to. And then there's one other thing. Money. It's a $500 billion enterprise, and some folks want to cut. To use as an example, I tell the story because I couldn't believe it when somebody sent it to me, but there's a clip on CNBC of a fund manager arguing that people should invest in for-profit charter management companies so that they can get money when the dividends come in their personal bank accounts. Now, I don't know about you, but really? I don't expect money that I invest in public education to have any leftovers. It's all supposed to be invested in the kids. And it certainly shouldn't be going into my bank account or anybody else's. It should be invested in the kids. And he goes on in that clip, and I'll send it to you if you want to see it. He goes on in that clip to say that it's a good investment because it's recession-proof because of the annual influx of public money. And not to worry if the charter schools close because they've already charged and recouped a lot of their costs by charging rent because they buy the building and then they charge rent for the building and then they hire the people. You get where I'm going. Perhaps people are comfortable with this. I'm personally not. So let's go back to those 5 dimensions of publicness. What do vouchers, and here when I'm saying charters, you know, the closer the charter school is to the public school district, the less it departs from those 5 aspects of publicness. The more it's on that other end, kind of heading toward the for-profit management, the more it's like the vouchers, really. So we have now a blend of public and private purposes, but once you shift into a private system, the private, you know, if you play euchre, right, you got trump. The private purposes trump the public purposes once you shift into a private setting. It retains the money, but I don't think public education is just about money. Schools control the access, and the private schools' choices may actually balkanize. So we're not learning from people who are different. We're only going to schools where people are just like us. Public accountability is very limited, and there's no accountability, completely shielded from voters. And the more the authorizer is not a school board or some elected body, the more it's attenuated and shielded from vouchers or from voters too. There is no public definition of a curriculum. The private schools can have whatever curriculum they want as long as they meet the definition of a private school in the state of Wisconsin, which is 875 hours of instruction and a curriculum in some of the basic subjects. Not, remember those 2 groups of subjects that I showed you before? They're only the beginning group of subjects, not any of the second group of subjects. And of course, they don't have to provide the same access because they don't have to provide special ed, English language services. They could say no, for example, to kids who are gay if they said that it conflicted with their principles. They could do that. So there's a whole host of other ways that it's not public in that way. I'm going to tell you about this book really quickly. I don't do research on efficacy, but the Lewinsky's got to have a great book out, and you should take a peek. What did they find? They found that public schools actually outperform private schools once you control for who attends them, right? Because often who attends them, what's really the big issue? The big issue is, let's be honest, it's poverty. That's the big issue that we have to attend to that's really causing our differences. And when private schools don't have as many kids of poverty, then they perform better in the aggregate. Public schools also outperform, here goes, charter schools, if it comes up, on the average. And then in terms of international, have you always heard that, you know, the public schools are failing, and when we compare ourselves, it's always Finland you compare ourselves to. By the way, there's some good writings on some folks from Finland who said, but that's because we copied your policies from the 1970s, which is kind of funny. But if you control for poverty, you find that maybe we're not at the top, but we're in the highest, among the highest in the world. And if you control it in more, you can see how it happens. So once you control for who's taking the tests, the picture looks completely different. To underscore that point, maybe, I'm sorry that this keeps happening. Okay, so see where that 0 is? They're comparing to traditional public schools. So 0 is public schools. And so if they find scores that go above the line, it means that they're doing better than public schools. Below the line, they're doing worse than public schools, right? So if we look at just raw school achievement scores, where you don't control for anything, just who attends there, all of those groups of schools do better than public schools in the aggregate. But once you control for demographics, you control for poverty, you control for those factors, look what happens. That's the gray bands. And in fact, those little dots means that those are statistically significant results, results that could not be explained or would not likely happen by chance. That's what that means. Here's the 8th grade, same thing. Above the line when we don't control, below the line when we do. We don't have as many statistically significant results. And of course, if it's not statistically significant, it means it's about the same, right? So they're about the same or worse. But there aren't any, there's just one that's, now in the gray, there's none that are statistically significant above the line. So this is one thing I would encourage you to think about. When they have proposals, what problem are we trying to address here? How do we know it's a problem here? How do we know what's the proposed solution and what does research tell us? And if it's not plumb, if those don't all line up, then I'd say there's a problem. Finally, beware of some research that really isn't. There's some think tank kind of reports that come out that look like research when they actually aren't. There's a really cool project out of the University of Colorado that takes those think tank reports and then subjects them to peer review, which is what I have to go through if I'm going to get published. And you can take a look at them. When they say they're good things, they'll tell you they're good things. If they're not, they'll tell you why it's not good. And then I showed you that book, but there are some other good books that show the same thing. Diane Ravitch's book is particularly interesting because Diane was one of the architects of these privatization programs, and she did a complete 180 turnaround and a mea culpa a couple years ago. And then just some final thoughts, and then let's open it up for questions. And based on my research, I argue that the constitutional obligation to fund public schools is paramount and cannot be subordinated to a legislative desire to subsidize the private choices of individual parents. One, we have to do, the Constitution says so. Yes, we could change our Constitution, but do we want to do that? And unless and until we do change our Constitution, it creates a constitutional obligation to fund public schools in order to create sound basic education for all of the kids in the state of Wisconsin. What the state Supreme Court said about the voucher program, and the charter program too for that matter, is that they're extra in addition to what's happening. So if you want to, as one of my students said, public schools are your homework, they're what you're obligated to do. The other is when you go out and play. And the legislature needs to attend to its homework before it can play in voucher land. Which means that you can have a public school system without a choice program, but you can't have choice unless the public system is worth choosing, unless you have sufficiently strong public school system. And they've established that, in fact, the Constitution creates a right, a real right, a substantive right to an education, not merely a privilege to shop for one. And that if we're going to redefine public education by chipping away at those aspects of publicness, I think we need to be having a lot more conversations about whether or not we really are comfortable with those choices and the consequences of them. So with that, let's open it up for questions. Right there, there's someone over here in a white sweater with a mic, can run over that direction.
How do we get the attention of Madison? They're not here. They're not listening. Oh, one is good.
Yay.
Good.
Well,
Thank you.
I mean, you're right. We have to, and so I think we have to use every power that we have as voters in this great state. So we need to contact your representatives. You need to let them know what you believe. You let them know what you think is a good idea, what you think is not a good idea, and what you think the state demands of them, and be persistent and be loud. I think we also need to talk to the neighbors that didn't come with us tonight so that they understand these issues and what's at stake. I think we need to talk to each other. I think we need to, as much as we're able and comfortable doing so, getting the word out. And if the vote goes in a way that we don't think is appropriate, to hold those people who made those votes accountable the next time we have an opportunity to do so. I wish I had something that was easier. I wish I knew how to really get their attention. I mean, I'm in walking distance of the Capitol, and I've never once, even though I have sent things, and there are some legislators that I think are just fabulous, and I have sent stuff, and I've never been asked to come down and talk to them once. Not that I'm the only one that can talk about this. There are dozens of people that can talk about this, but we have to find a way to be as persistent and loud as those voices that are saying that this is a good idea. If you think, in fact, it is a bad idea. I think it's a bad idea, but if you think it's a good idea, be persistent and loud about that choice too, and I will be on the other side, and we'll see what happens. That's what democracy is. Go ahead.
I don't understand now. My daughter herself teaches in the charter school. Oh, my daughter teaches in the charter school at Wausau East here.
Yeah.
Now, that's different than the private ones? I mean, how do the kids get into that? That's what I don't understand.
Okay. Well, charter schools are by there are 42 states in the country that have charter schools. Charter schools, by definition, are voluntary enrollment schools. But beyond that, there are lots of differences state to state to state. But they're voluntary enrollment schools. They are created by virtue of a charter contract that is a performance contract that can be revoked if they fail to do certain things, and can be non-renewed at the end of its term if they fail to do certain things. So the thinking behind charter schools when they were first implemented in Minnesota was that school boards got too many political slings and arrows when they tried to close low-performing public schools. So if we create these charter schools and they have this limited term contract and they're not performing, then it'll be easier to close those. Good idea in theory, hasn't worked out that way in fact, because in fact all of the same political slings and arrows that stopped school boards from closing low-performing traditional public schools try to stop the authorizer from non-renewing the low-performing charter schools. Has it happened? Sure, it has. And again, those charter schools, especially those that are operated closely tethered to school districts, are doing pretty well. They're more like traditional public schools than the other. If you kind of think of it as a continuum between publicness and privateness, they're more over here than they are over there. Voucher schools are private schools who have no relationship to school boards whatsoever. Okay, do we have another question? Here in front, and then, well, there's there we go. And then the gentleman just diagonally behind her.
In your study and in your research, has there been a concern about schools being developed by the for-profit organizations organizations that would have their own ideological curriculum, and in other words, be a breeding ground for eventually the destruction of democracy, where you brainwash the young people going through the system to be corporate pawns, in a sense.
I would say that that concern comes up more in the voucher sector than the charter sector, and part of the reason is that we still have some controls in the charter sector. One, states can relieve charter schools from compliance with state regulations, but charter schools have to fully comply with all federal laws. Secondly, in order to be a charter school, you have to lay out your curriculum, so at least there's supposed to be somebody who's looking over that. Voucher schools and the schools, private schools that choose to participate in voucher programs don't have that same scrutiny. They don't have to submit their curricula for approval, for example. They have to adopt standards, and you're right, once you create a voucher program, you have to permit any school that meets those standards to participate, and they can emphasize or de-emphasize whatever they like, which is why I talked about that public curriculum being at risk. That aspect of publicness is at risk when we shift to a voucher program using public monies to subsidize private choices. Okay, the gentleman behind you.
You had mentioned earlier about the charter or voucher school that could be granted as the voucher as access, but then they can expand it in as many locations as they wanted.
Under the current proposal,
Great.
right?
Is there anyone currently doing this, and where do you see this happening? Do you see somebody that has this in mind? That's why they did this?
Well, again, those who are seeking to privatize want to have as many options as possible. So the interests that are aligned behind that. ALEC is one, the American Legislative Exchange Council. California permits that, and Arizona permits that. One charter, multiple locations. There may be a couple of others. In general, most states that have charter schools, like the current system in Wisconsin, limit the authorizers to school boards, and school boards are overwhelmingly the authorizer that has created most charter schools across the country. But in those jurisdictions, in those states that permit other entities to charter schools, that's where you see often frankly the charter chains that move in. Right here.
Did I miss the proposed cost? The projected cost of the change in the voucher system?
I don't have that in front of me. I can send to you what's there. Part of the argument, if I went back to that slide, is that they're proposing that it's budget neutral because it's taking the state aid and dumping it into that pot. But remember that a whole bunch of those kids aren't generating state aid right now because they're already in the private system. So I haven't seen anything that explains to me how they're going to handle that. As I said, the dividend is staying the same, and the divisor is getting bigger in terms of state equalization aid. So how they're going to account for that, I haven't seen that. That's one of my questions that I need to have answered, frankly, because I need to understand that better.
Voodoo math.
Perhaps. Right here? Right there. Right in front of you. There you go.
I want to know if I understand this properly, that when you're talking about the possible constitutional obligation of the legislature as determined by the Supreme Court in 2000, that if that the potential breaking point for this would be that they are taking money away from schools that need it in order to meet that fundamental right, that if they created a separate fund to fund these schools, they would avoid that. But as long as they take the money away from public schools and deprive students of the ability to have equal education throughout the state, they could be talking about putting something in the budget that could be determined unconstitutional because of its effect on some school districts.
Right.
Is that correct?
So there are two ways that this could happen. It could be one that they're saying that that funding the private system is taking money from the public system, which is currently what is happening, and that is then depriving the public system. The public system no longer meets the constitutional standard. There's another way, though, and that's it doesn't matter how you fund this thing. If you aren't funding this thing, meaning the voucher system, doesn't matter how you fund it over here. If you're not funding the constitutional standard, it doesn't matter. It's kind of like when we're paying our bills at home. I really, I have my eye on this really cool briefcase, but it costs a lot, and I really need to pay the heating bill. Right? So if I want to keep my family warm, I'm going to have to pay my heating bill before I can write the check and treat myself to this luxury that is this really pretty leather bag that I would like to have. It's the same thing here. With all good intentions, the legislatures may want to subsidize the private choices of individual parents in a voucher system, but our Constitution doesn't let them do that until they satisfy their obligation to public schools. They got to meet their constitutional obligations first. That's my argument. Down here in the front and then back.
I have been trying to be persistent, or that's my goal with my legislator. And the last time I spoke with her, she shared numbers with me, and I guess I'm going to ask if those numbers are correct, and then for how we can keep in touch with someone like you to check their answers that they give to us.
Sure.
She, after talking with her about that they are taking money away from the public system to fund another system, and that won't work, she said to me, her answer was it only costs about $7,000 to educate a child through the voucher system, and about $12,000 for pupil in the public education system. Is that number? That doesn't seem to compare with what you shared with us tonight.
It depends on what you look at. But remember, the obligations in the two systems are different, right? The most costly and difficult to serve kids, which roll into that per pupil amount in the public system, include special ed, English language learning services, and others. The private system does not. They're not serving those. So yes, it does, in terms of the amount of the voucher that's there, it is less. It absolutely is less. But my response to that would be, so? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if our obligation under the Constitution is to fund education to the standard that the Supreme Court has said, then we have to fund education to the standard that the Supreme Court has said, no matter what you've sent the voucher for private systems at. I don't really care. Meet your obligation first. Do your homework. Then you can play. Right? Right there, and then in the back in the blue shirt.
We send all our children to the Catholic high school, mm-hmm. and I understand, well, most of them, and I'd have no hang up about that at all. We were perfectly willing to pay the tuition, and did, of course. They didn't have vouchers or anything like that in those days. But I have very, very difficulty understanding when we have constitutionally and traditionally and fundamentally a separation of church and state, how we can give vouchers to any religious schools. Mm-hmm. And apparently the Supreme Court says we can do that. I have a question of you, if you probably can't answer, but supposing I'm a Muslim, I live in a pretty big Muslim neighborhood, and I want to set up a voucher madrasa school there. Or I'm a Scientologist, and I got a pretty good following. I want to send up a school in Scientology and get vouchers for these things. What's the story there? Would I get them?
Yep, you would. Terrible. So two things to explain. First, the Supreme Court decided, well, first, our state Supreme Court decided in the case Jackson versus Benson in 1998, and then that case actually was appealed to the United States Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court denied cert, which means they denied hearing. Well, the fancy word is certiorari, but they said, you know, go away, we don't want to hear this case right now. So they didn't render any decision, and that meant that the decision by the Wisconsin Supreme Court that upheld vouchers as not offending the religion clause in either our state constitution or the federal constitution stood, but only in the state of Wisconsin. Then 4 years later, in a case called Zellman versus Simmons-Harris, a case out of Cleveland that went through the federal system, the Supreme Court did take the case, and they determined that it did not violate the Establishment Clause because, and they established a test. So they said that a voucher program does not violate the Establishment Clause if it has attends to three issues. First, it has a legitimate secular purpose. Well, education is generally considered a legitimate secular purpose, so it's, you know, kind of sails over that one. Although Justice Stevens wouldn't have let them off quite that easily, but he was in the dissent. Then the second one is that they don't define recipients with regard to religion, which means that the person who gets the aid does not have to be a certain religion or not a certain religion. So everybody gets the aid regardless of the religion. And then third, that the private individual has a genuine choice among secular and sectarian choices and can direct the aid. So what hinged it for the Supreme Court was saying that it wasn't the state, because the Establishment Clause is a limitation on government. So we're looking for a state actor, somebody related to government, for the Establishment Clause to apply. And because the private parent was deciding where the money went by enrolling their child in the school, be it public or private, non-religious or private religious, that it was a private individual directing the money, and therefore it did not offend the Constitution. But when that happens, when a state elects to have a voucher program, they can't say, well, these religious schools are okay, we like those religious schools we don't. They have to be what the court has called viewpoint neutral, and they have to let everybody have the same access. So it wouldn't matter what religion the school was, they can participate in the voucher program as long as they meet the definition of the conditions for participation that the legislature has set out in the voucher law itself and the definition of what a private school is in the state of Wisconsin. So, and any religion, or no religion, either. Okay, where did I go next? I don't remember. Sorry, I've lost track. I'll let our microphone people decide. How's that?
In Arizona, the money was based on daily attendance, and there was one day that they count as the major attendance day for the year. Is there a point in Wisconsin where the funding is now locked into the charter school or the private school, wherever the voucher is, and then if the student then transfers back into public school, the money stays with the original?
Yeah, so everybody in schools knows it's the third Friday count. That's what we pay attention to, the third Friday count. That means if somebody's gone on the fourth Monday, the money doesn't follow them. We do have it set up in the voucher programs that they get quarterly payments, and so they have to verify their enrollment. So the money, if somebody went back on the fourth Monday, I mean, I was being a little facetious, but if they went back on the fourth Monday, they wouldn't have to return the money for that quarter, but the next quarter they wouldn't get funds for that person. But that does mean that the public system is educating the kid without any aid in the meeting, you know, because we take whoever shows up, and if they show up after the third Friday, the state doesn't say, wow, really? You had 5 new families move in October? Here's some more money. That didn't happen. You got to serve them because they showed up.
You mentioned special needs. I taught 32 years of high school special needs, and our district was renowned for that. And it made our district a little more expensive to operate.
Sure.
And our department was the biggest any department in the school.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I know that the Department of Public Instruction has some very specific credentialing for public school teachers.
Yes.
What are the credentialing requirements for the charter and voucher school teachers?
Charter school teachers have to be licensed in the state of Wisconsin. That's not true everywhere, although there is an alternative path to licensure for charter school teachers that allows them at least to start teaching without licensure and move toward licensure, but eventually all charter school teachers have to be fully licensed. Private school teachers, the current requirement in the law, if you participate in the voucher program, if you don't participate in the voucher program, you can do whatever you want. But if you participate in the voucher program, the vouchers private schools the teachers have to have at least a bachelor's degree, and the teachers' aides have to have at least a high school diploma. But but they don't have to have licensure at all.
I'm sorry. I've been following this pretty close, and I guess where I'm struggling with their whole proposal on this is the fact that I have 2 grown children. One is at UW-Eau Claire. But as a taxpayer in a local school district, I have an investment.
Yes, you do.
In the infrastructure that's there.
Mm-hmm.
And where these politicians are going, they're playing with fire. When you have a significant investment in infrastructure, if you look at this building, what it takes to operate a building like this, now you're going to take funding away from these school districts and give it to somebody that's going to build another building to have these kids.
Right.
They are going to end up making cuts within that school district. But the problem is you can't just downsize a building.
Nope.
I've done work for school systems privately, and I feel for the people that are there. I don't know what's wrong with these people in Madison. Honest to God, I don't know if
they're very nice.
I'm sorry, I don't like to get rude, but they're playing with fire. And if the people in this state don't stand up to them for once and all and say, you know what, this is ludicrous, keep the control at the local level, keep the funding across the board and be done. If that doesn't happen, I don't know where the state's going to go, because I know the school districts that I've done work for, and me as a taxpayer and an owner of part of that infrastructure, it's going to end up costing me more money. And what scares me the most is the way they're going at the referendum system.
Right.
So they're going to pull money away from my infrastructure. They're going to pull money away supporting that. They're going to hamstring us because we're going to have to try and float a referendum to keep those buildings maintained and those people's paid. And all it's going to do is pit me against my neighbor. My kids are grown and gone, other than my son at Eau Claire, and I'm paying for that. But I'll gladly pay for my neighbor's kids to go to school in a public school system because their parents paid for me.
Thank you. One little note about that, because you mentioned local control, and I don't think I said this, but it's something that I would encourage you to think about. As we adopt policies that reduce local control, particularly when we're talking about education and the control or the authority of a local school board, that not only reduces the control of the school board, that reduces your franchise as a voter. So the value of your vote and your ability to influence just was diminished by diminishing the local control of any local governmental unit. So I think, again, if we collectively decide to do that, okay, but we need to do it with eyes wide open of what we're risking and whether or not we're really ready to accept those risks. It's 8:01, so I don't know if I'm happy to keep talking, but, you know, I'm here, so you got me. Somebody, there's right here, a question right here, and then we can, then way in the back.
Julie, please elaborate on that statement you made. Public education is a $500 billion enterprise, because I don't think that one's hard to sink in.
Yeah, that's not just in Wisconsin, that's across the country.
Right.
Because these efforts to privatize, to find a way to get some of that money into private hands, people want a piece of that money. That's good money, that's a lot of money. And the more that we can divest ourselves from public education and promote or allow private entities to provide that service. And I mean, I really do wonder, what are they have to be scrimping on something. Because the people who work in school districts, I mean, even when I was a school administrator in the 90s, my budget was tight in the 90s, and it's way tighter now. There's nothing to, I mean, I don't know where you would make the cuts. I mean, I think of my little department, we got an email this week, we have to figure out where to cut 6% of our budget for 4% for the next year and 2% for the following year. And where we cut our budget the last time around, there's anything to cut. What else are we going to cut? So I think when I know that because I played with numbers, I wonder what are they scrimping on, that there's money left over for somebody's bank account, or there's money to pay somebody literally millions of dollars. I don't get it. I really don't. I don't understand. There in the back.
Last question. First of all, I want to thank everybody that came. I'm one of the people that's in the legislature, but unfortunately, I'm not one of the ones that you need to convince, because I'm here for all of you. My name is Janet Bewley. Thank you, Dr. Mead. This is wonderful. I just want to make a couple observations, if you don't mind. The first one is, I know I don't have to remind you in this room about how important a role the Supreme Court in our state plays, and that a really wonderful person is running for Supreme Court, for re-election to the Supreme Court. See, aren't you glad that I said that instead of you, so you don't have to worry about it?
Yeah.
Okay, I get to say whatever I want.
You go right ahead.
Another thing is that perhaps one of the things that's helpful when you think about this $500 billion industry and how much they want it, look at how hard it is to get that huge multi-billion-dollar industry called healthcare back in the public hands where it belongs. It's already there. We can't get it away. It's already in the private sector. People are making money off of your illnesses, and now they want to make money off of teaching your kids. So it's the same thing. It's the same desire to use public money for the private good. So that's something we have to watch. The last observation that I want to make is keep in mind that the voucher idea came about because of a failing school district and the belief that Milwaukee couldn't solve its own problems, and so the legislature had to go in there and solve it for them. And from that experiment, the people that would love to see this expand all over the state realized a good thing when they saw it. And it's not about solving the problems of one failing school system anymore, it's about making money. But, pardon me, thank you.
I would like to just address that very briefly at the end, because I think it's important. You saw that number, that $191 billion that we are collectively investing in the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program in the state of Wisconsin this year. What are we getting for $191 million, right? We know from research that those schools are doing no better than the schools in the Milwaukee public school system. In fact, the Milwaukee public school system schools are outperforming the voucher schools on the average. So that justification is there. And so what we know is we've done this experiment, we've invested all this money, and it has not borne fruit. It hasn't given us what Milton Friedman and others said it would give us. What we'll never know and what we can't know is what would have happened in Milwaukee if we had taken that money and invested it in the schools that already existed. I wish I had Hermione Granger's, you know, if you're Harry Potter fans, her little time turner. You know, so we could do our little time turner thing and we could go back and try that and see what would happen if we had invested that money. Thank you very much for coming. Our time is done. I'll hang around if you still have questions. I'll be happy to entertain them. Just let me get down off the stage.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Mead.
I'm happy to have been here.
I'm just going to say a couple words. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Mead, for taking your precious time to come up and educate us. I just want to remind you of some upcoming events. On Tuesday, March 12th, we have Jay Heck, Executive Director from Common Cause in Wisconsin, coming to talk about the impact of big money on Wisconsin politics. Thursday, thank you. I can't read with my glasses. On Saturday, March 14th, we have an international jazz musician, Ali Paris, coming, and he plays the Canon, and he'll be accompanied by UW-Stevens Point faculty Ryan Korb, jazz percussionist, and Tom McComb, jazz and Brazilian guitarist, and he'll be doing an audience talkback on his musical journey. And then on Tuesday, March 17th, we'll be doing a forum on mayor versus administrator, who should run City Hall in Wausau. So please join us for that. And if you've enjoyed tonight's event, if you can donate even a little bit, for example, $30 will get you a Dave Obey Raising Hell for Justice book and a CD. Please make your check out to WIPS for $30. You can see Connie and Mandy in the back. We will have this videotaped and on our new website, which we're launching next week, or you can purchase a DVD in a couple weeks, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Thanks again.
Really appreciate it.